Okay, welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciella Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24 and hitting that subscribe button.
And you can follow at ID24Conf on Twitter. And if you have any questions for any of our presenters throughout the 24 hours, please just tweet them to us with the ID24 hashtag, and we'll ask them at the end of the session. Do need to say a quick hello to 3 ID24U events taking place at the moment. Need to say a very warm hello to ID24U Amherst and the UMass Dubois Library. Hello, everyone there. We also have a team listening in with ID24U Ann Arbor and the University of Michigan and the Hatcher Library. Hello, everyone there, and welcome. And last but by no means least, we have ID24U Lincoln from the Nebraska Digital Accessibility Meetup. So quite a crowd gathered in various places across the United States to tune in live. David Caldwell, over to you.
Thank you. So next up, we have Dafydd Henke-Reed from AbilityNet. He's going to be talking about elegant accessibility. Dafydd, over to you.
Awesome, thank you very much. So yes, hello everyone, I am Dafydd and I'm from AbilityNet. So I'm one of the senior consultants over at AbilityNet and I work with accessibility and usability. Now, what that means practically is I do a lot of WCAG audits or WCAG audits. That means that I take the kind of web content accessibility guidelines and I apply them to apps and websites to kind of test their conformance. Also a lot of user testing, whereby we kind of get users in that are actually kind of using this assistive technology to get a sense of, once we've kind of passed a compliance stage, how kind of real world usable, how real world accessible is the things we're making. Also conferences, and more generally, I do a lot of complaining, which is kind of the end result of a lot of WCAG audits and user testing. Now, I'm going to start off this presentation with something of a paradox, because that seems like a very rock and roll way of starting a webinar. And that's two things. One is that people generally care about accessibility, but also that websites are inaccessible. Now that seems like quite a strange thing, that we simultaneously care, but for some reason this doesn't seem to be doing enough. Now, a kind of joking way to put this is, are we somehow caring wrong, or can we somehow get a better return on investment in the way in which we care about accessibility? And we'll talk a lot about methodologies. For example, if we're, say, following waterfall or agile, are we not incorporating accessibility into whatever methodology we have well enough? Another one is about moving accessibility back. So, for example, back into the design stage. And these are all very, very noble goals that will get results, but I don't think it matters in the way in which we often think that it matters. Particularly, I don't think it matters when you care about accessibility, because people already generally care. And I don't think it's a lack of caring that creates inaccessible websites. So, as I said, I have a lot of clients and I do a lot of audits for them, a lot of use testing for them. And you might think that I kind of receive kind of multiple kind of different statements from them. So I might expect to hear from a client that they don't know whether or not their website is inaccessible or not, and they want me to tell them. Or perhaps I would expect them to tell me that they know it's accessible, that they know that they have done their homework, and they've come to me after so much work to verify that for them, to be a kind of a second party or a third party who can kind of look in and quickly say, yep, you've done a good job. But neither of those are really the case. What I hear time and time again is, I know that it is not accessible. And a lot of my work comes from a place of caring, where people say, we really want this to be accessible, but we also know that it isn't. So people care about accessibility, but we're nonetheless creating inaccessible websites. And that's what I'm going to be trying to kind of piece apart today and to get a sense of why is that the case. So we can look at this in a kind of metaphor, and I often end up talking about cars. So ideally, we would make something that didn't have problems in the first place. It would work because we never broke it. The idea being is that we make something, we know it works, and then we verify the fact that it works. The idea being that we wouldn't make a car and then sell it to a customer knowing that, well, actually, it doesn't really work in the way in which we expect it to work. But what seems to happen with accessibility, or more better put, more websites in general, is that we make things that are less functional. So we make something and we know that it has issues. We identify those issues and we fix those issues. The kind of analogy here being that we create the car, we make the car, we engineer the car, we do whatever testing needs to be done, and we realize that actually the car's not road legal. We know that we can't actually ship this car to people. And so we essentially fix it with duct tape. We go to the car and we say, okay, what do we need to do to make this legal in a way in which that we couldn't, and we know we couldn't when we were making it. So that's an issue. And that's an issue that we can talk about in terms of pushing accessibility back, say, to the design stage, or better incorporating it in the way we work. For example, if we're pushing for more kind of quick turnaround agile sprints. But it nonetheless doesn't really capture why these issues are created in the first place. Because when we're creating other things, we wouldn't automatically assume that whatever we're making is going to be broken in ways in which we're going to have to fix. Or rather, we wouldn't have to think about a way of saying, I'm going to make something. I know that when I first make it, it's going to be broken in a way that I'm somehow going to have to incorporate a system that then fixes those issues. Now, we can blame accessibility for this. And this is something that I perhaps hear slightly too often from people that do otherwise care about accessibility. And it's a problem of, well, accessibility is hard. And I'm going to come back to that a few times, this idea of accessibility being a challenge. Now, you may or may not have heard about one of the accessibility leads at WordPress stepping down recently. And one of the comments they provided was, I get a lot of feedback that some accessibility issues are too big, that we should have made them smaller. The kind of conceit being that accessibility is this big thing. It's a big, big thing where you can make something and then you think, well, we only have scope to fix small things, or we're already live and so we can't do big changes. We can't go back to the drawing board. Again, with the analogy of the car, we can't go back and redesign this car, so we just have to do small little incremental changes to it. But we can't do that with accessibility. They're big issues and, well, it'll be easier if they were smaller issues. But that's the polite explanation that somehow accessibility is to blame. But the issue here is, I think, that it's more of a symptom of a bigger problem, that what accessibility does is that it exposes a larger problem at play that is to do with elegance. Because an impolite explanation is that the problems that we have with websites are ones that we create ourselves. An important thing to say is that websites are not broken by default. They are functional, they're high-performing, and they're accessible. At some point when we make websites, we break them. They go from being fast, they go from being pretty responsive, they go from being things that are, on the whole, accessible. Now, that's not true for kind of every single thing that we care about in terms of accessibility. So, for example, you can make a video and you can not give audio descriptions. You do have to kind of add that on as an addition. But when we talk about, say, headings, when we talk about, say, well, the operability of links and buttons when using a screen reader, for example, this is all stuff that comes free and out of the box, and at some point is broken. Now, this quote comes from a URL that I initially had in my slides, but removed because it contains a swear word. But if you Google the problems we have with websites are ones that we create, you'll come across a very interesting article that talks about, in quite frank terms, a problem with the web. So what is the solution? So hopefully something that I've been able to communicate is this idea that an issue with accessibility isn't actually the fault of accessibility. The problem is that we have lots and lots of websites that we make, that we know are broken, and we know we need to fix. So I've made something, and how am I going to solve the problem? Well, for any kind of web developers that are on the call, they might say, well, ARIA is the solution. Now, if you don't know what ARIA is, you can kind of simply think of it as being code that you can add to boost accessibility. So for example, if you're making a link or a button or something then more complicated than that, so something that isn't just a native element but somehow has some kind of extra properties. So for example, it's an accordion, which is a button, but it also has extra behavior. For example, it expands and collapses and does something that isn't inherently within the letter of the HTML specification law. It's something that does something more. Then you can add ARIA to it. You could say ARIA expanded on a button, for example, and assistive technology would come across that button and go, that's not just a button, it's an expandable button. But what's the problem with that? Well, I think WebAIM put it very well, where they defined ARIA as being both the cause and solution to all of their accessibility problems. And I'm going to read a quote from one of their articles, which is, almost every report outlines ARIA uses that need to be corrected or, most often, removed. Ironically, this is often followed by a list of issues that can only be addressed with ARIA. Now, I think that's very telling. The idea that when we get these websites that we know are inaccessible, the first thing we have to do is say, you need to remove a lot of what you've done in an effort to make it accessible. There's a lot of ARIA here whose main purpose is to make things accessible, and a lot of it needs to be tweaked or, as they put it, more often, actually taken out. But at the same time, there's so much of the website that can only be made accessible with ARIA. Now, ARIA is a tool like any other one that's going to be in the web developer's toolkit, but it is also a standard. At the same time, it's incredibly important to note that there are rules to ARIA, and the very first rule of ARIA is that if you don't have to use ARIA, don't use ARIA. Now, they do give exceptions to this. They say, if you can use native semantics, then use the native semantics. But that's essentially saying the same thing. That is, if you can get away without using ARIA, then really you should. And this correlates with what WebAIM say, where they come across websites which are overloaded with ARIA that needs to be removed, but then at the same time, they're looking across the website and finding loads and loads of things where actually the only way to make it accessible is with ARIA. That seems to then to be at odds with the official documentation for ARIA, which says that actually the best scenario is having no ARIA at all. Now, let's look at an example of that, because that was quite high level. And a classic one is modal dialogs. You might think of them as being pop-ups or overlays. You're on a website and suddenly there's a kind of micro page that appears in the middle of the page that's kind of extra to whatever page you're looking at. They often do this, say, for cookie acceptance policies or special offers, or more recently, for example, if you're using an ad blocker, you might notice they use a modal dialog or a pop-up or an overlay to basically lament the fact that you're using an ad block. And there are loads of accessibility issues that are really core to the very nature of a modal dialog. So for example, a standard practice with a modal dialog is that you dim the background. So for example, you have a modal dialog that appears on the screen and behind it, the kind of background of the page that was previously available becomes unresponsive to mouse and keyboard and is visually dimmed. And that's outside of videos. That's really the only reason why suddenly in an instant, the screen would be going from one color to another, where it would be, say, full color to being almost kind of blacked over, which is really one of the few cases where you have a dimmed and undimmed background effect, which potentially can cause, say, photosensitive seizures. It's also a nightmare in terms of focus management. So, for example, the idea being that you should never cause a keyboard trap on a website. You should never restrict a keyboard user from being able to navigate wherever they want to on a page. I should be able to tab through every interactive element, and anything I want to land on, I should hit enter or space, and I should operate that element. Except where modal dialogs are concerned, and I should restrict focus to that modal dialog because I don't want to have to be tabbing through the background of the page that now should be inoperable. There's problems with screen reader semantics because there's no kind of, there are things like dialog roles and dialog tags, but they're not fantastically well supported. They kind of rely on the very latest tech, and generally there isn't the kind of the best compatibility with lots of different browsers. And more generally, it has a huge cognitive load to the page, because you've gone from having one page that maybe the users orientated themselves on, they understand, and suddenly there's an entire new page, because that's what it's doing. It's adding extra layers to a page that up until this modal dialog appeared was a single mono layer. And even the best examples of them require a lot of ARIA and a lot of inelegant JavaScript where you're manually having to set focus, you're, say, having to potentially run a query on all the background elements and using, say, tab index equals -1 to manually take them out of the focus order. You're making sure that all of the background containers are hidden, say with ARIA hidden, for example. And whilst there are polyfillers that are coming about, so for example, the inert property, there's a lot there that you have to do that's both expensive programmatically and ultimately isn't particularly elegant. So why do people use modal dialogs in the first place? Well, I'm here to make the argument that it's a crutch for committee-designed websites, because what they do is they remedy page overflow. The point of a modal dialogue is a way of saying, we have more content than we want to display on the page. We have lots of stuff going on in this page, and we can't all put it there in one place because that would be too much. It would be too much to put all of this thing on one simple static page. So what we're going to do is we're going to make the page dynamic. We're going to layer it. But surely the problem there isn't the fact that the modal dialogue needs to be used. Surely the problem is the fact that it can't just all be fitted onto one page in the first place. And that's what ARIA does. It masks website bloat. So for example, 9/10 of the issues that I come across with websites, which are the real challenges to solve. So outside of, say, that needs a label, that needs to be marked up as a table, when we get into the kind of real nitty-gritty of high priority issues where things fundamentally cannot be operated, and if I took to user testing would result in a user failing a task, it's often these complicated widgets that require a lot of ARIA to make in any way accessible, similar to what WebAIM were talking about. And if you think of a lot of them, like accordions, auto-suggests, tab panels, carousels, tree grids, and mega menus, ultimately, they all do the same thing. They hide content. For example, the accordion. All that's doing is taking what would be text on a page and hiding it so that you can toggle its visibility. A tab panel, exactly the same thing. Instead of having a vertical list of content, you instead put it in one little bit of content, but it kind of as a way of side-loading that overflow, where you might otherwise be worried about having too much on a page, you kind of secretly fit it into that tab panel. But at the same time, all they're doing is hiding content from users. They're taking a page that could be simple, needing to add more content to it, and as a result, creating a mountain of issues. Because as said, so many of the issues we come across come down to complex non-native controls wherein their only function is to allow pages to appear more simple than they actually are. And that isn't a fault of accessibility. So a good reference point is that Windows 95 was about 30 megabytes in size. And today we have websites that are heavier than that. So as an example, I ran a performance test on the McDonald's UK landing page, and it returned that the page load for just the landing page was about 6 megabytes, or about 5.9 megabytes. So for reference, the McDonald's landing page is about 25% of an old operating system. And for reference, one of them manages computer hardware and software resources, and the other one advertises processed beef. And the point at which today what we're talking about is that those things we expect to be of generally commensurate size. Because here's the real issue. It's a lack of brevity that is causing our accessibility problems. When I have a website and I have to report all the issues with their accordions, with their tab panels, with their mega menus, ultimately, the problem isn't that those components are inaccessible. They are inaccessible. The problem is that those components have been used in the first place. And this wouldn't be so problematic if people use them. But these things are bad user experience. People don't use the solution, and more often than not, content stays hidden. So we develop ever more elaborate ways of side-loading content onto a page, for example, with a carousel. We can't decide whether or which image to have on the landing page of our website. We can't simply have one image that we display front and center. We have to have, say, 5 images. Of course, they don't all fit on the page, so we need to develop a way that we can have all 5 images on that landing page, and so we have them horizontally scrolling, causing an experience for almost everyone that's ultimately pretty negative. Some UX research, for example, pointing to politely saying that accordions are not always the answer for complex content on desktops. And if we actually kind of read that article, the kind of things it points out is that users often don't open accordions, and that actually, if they're given a page that just has a lot of vertical scrolling to go through, but contains all that same information, but actually just displayed in a longer vertical list, then their ability to find that information, to recall that information, is actually markedly improved. And similarly with carousels, whenever we look and do kind of user research to carousels, we find that they don't improve the visibility of content. In fact, they do the opposite. They hide content and it doesn't become available to users. And in our own usability testing, or user testing rather, this is something that we consistently see. We see an avoidance of using anything complex when simpler solutions are available. Now, we might have an awareness of the idea of banner blindness. This is the kind of term related to if users are using a website and they come across something that looks like an ad, they'll look everywhere other than that ad. So for example, if you're developing a website and you use an image that looks a bit too much like an advertisement, then the users, even if it contains the exact information they need or the exact information that's required to complete a task, for example, they will not look at it. They'll look everywhere other on the page. And we've noticed the exact same thing with anything that is complex. So this, for example, is address lookups. You type in your postcode and it automatically feeds back what it thinks your address might be. But when we test this, we have all the users ignoring this. They look at the suggestions, they see a big list of possible addresses, and they say, well, I know my address, and I know my house number, I know my street name, and I know my postcode. So I'm just going to type those in. I type, tab, tab, type, done, as opposed to typing, scrolling, arrowing down, mousing down, looking through that list and rejecting 9/10 of the options because 9/10 of those options aren't their address, and then finding them when they want, clicking that option, verifying that it's properly added it to the page. Again, this is a way of hiding content, e.g. search results, but actually doesn't improve the efficiency with which the user can actually operate the website, or in this case, complete the form. We see the same thing, say, with date fields where a picker is available. So, for example, you tab onto an input field for entering a date of birth, for example, and a calendar appears, and you can click left and right to go month to month. There are combo boxes for selecting years, for example, and then you can click onto a specific day and it'll auto-populate the field. And again, this is consistently bypassed by users entirely who opt to manually input the date. And when asked, they say, well, I know the date, and I know the input mask. It, for example, says that it needs to be DD, MM, YY, and I know the date, because of course I do. It's my date. I shouldn't have to find what I'm looking for, because I already know it. And I know the easiest mechanism to tell the website that I know it, that's simply by typing it in. And that's generally software that's pretty well accessible in terms of being able to use a keyboard or a switch that's operating keyboard interface, or using a screen reader and a keyboard together, or using, say, a screen reader on mobile with a kind of touch interface. Generally speaking, you can do that much more easily than you can navigate every single month and every single year to find the exact right day that, as we've established, the user already knows. So what we can establish is that these create so many problems, and even when they're fixed as best as they can be fixed, no one really uses them. What's more is that we end up focusing on conformance. We're given websites that everyone knows are accessible. As I've said, when the client comes to me, they'll say, we care about accessibility, we honestly do. And they do. And they'll say, and we know we have this website, and we know that it's inaccessible. And we can take the guidelines and we can apply them, and we can take their extraordinarily complicated controls. We can, as the web aims say, we can talk about the ways in which they need to remove their ARIA recommendations from, or tweak their recommendations from, and then we can find all of their components that actually need a lot of complicated ARIA to actually fix. But does that really solve the problem? Well, no. We still end up with, to go back to the previous example, a car that we know isn't road legal and that we have to fix after making it, which creates these incredibly inelegant solutions where we're adding more and more complication to a page by adding more and more ARIA, more and more text, more and more content, hidden text that explains, for example, to screen reader users how to use a complicated control. But this doesn't help everyone. So, for example, screen magnification and cognitive accessibility are challenging. It's much easier to comment objectively on whether or not a button works for a screen reader, for example. But consider a zoomed-in user struggling with a bloated website. They struggle, for example, with frequently asked questions section that contains multiple paragraphs. Now, the question is, well, how do we make blocks of text easy to perceive for screen magnification users? Because they're going up and down and left and right, and it's really hard to find the exact core information that they're looking for, which ultimately is often just one sentence that's layered within paragraph after paragraph and paragraph. So again, the simple question is, well, how can we make these blocks of text easy to perceive for screen magnification users? And the answer is to simply have less of it. Have less text. If you want to make something that's easier to use for everyone in terms of both, say, conformance and using such technologies, both of which are easy to test for like screen readers and ones which are harder to test for like screen magnifiers, the simple solution is to make your website more simple. This also moves responsibility. So at the moment, everything we've talked about belies accessibility as being the responsibility of the tester. The idea being, again, that we've made a car, we know it doesn't work, we know it's not road legal, and it's up to the tester to come along to identify the ways in which it isn't road legal, and then for someone to come along and hot fix it. And again, the idea being that, well, it needs to be pushed back. It's not the case of we need to care about accessibility more, it's that we shouldn't be creating these problems in the first place that need fixing. And the thing is, this is not a secret. Everyone knows the following points. We know that we are creating fragile websites. Anyone here who's tried to maintain a website for a long period of time knows how incredibly difficult it is, because suddenly the code base that we used is depreciated, it's no longer up to date. We made a lot of hacks at the time that really are no longer supported, and really we shouldn't have to have done in the first place. A new browser update has broken something that, again, we probably shouldn't have done anyway. And we know that we're creating sites that are really bloated with content. Almost all of the kind of new and innovative patterns that we've talked about, again, they're all ways of masking an underlying symptom, which is our websites have too much stuff on them. And again, we know this. We know that feature creep is a problem. We struggle with it every day when we're hearing, oh, could we just add this to the website? Or what about this? And, well, I feel we would really need this on the website. And instead of saying no and having a very kind of delineated and small vision, we instead please everyone by using these kind of newer and newer widgets, when all they're doing is finding new and newer ways of having more stuff on a page, whilst it actually seeming to be simple. And actually, it's not. And so the problem, in a nutshell, it's not that we don't care about accessibility. We do. It's that we're unable or unwilling to be brief. Something I said earlier in this presentation was that lack of care doesn't create inaccessible websites. And that was potentially a statement that I worried might be controversial, because the response can be, well, what does create inaccessible websites? Because surely it's people who don't care about accessibility at the design stage, or they've made something and they really should have considered accessibility. But again, almost everyone I speak to cares about accessibility and talks about how much research they're doing into it, the work they've done here, the people they're talking to, including AbilityNet, to try to make their websites more accessible. But they nonetheless come to us saying, we know it's inaccessible, we really do care, and we really are trying to read up on it, but we're still finding it very, very difficult. And the problem there isn't that they've made websites that are knowingly inaccessible. We occasionally come across little hiccups, for example, a heading that's being created in pure CSS rather than in semantic HTML. But generally speaking, we don't see that. Generally speaking, people make pages that are, at their basic level, pretty well designed, pretty well developed. The problems come about when we see more and more added to those pages. And therewith, developers don't include accordions on their website, for example, because they don't care about those using assistive technology. They don't just throw an accordion on and think to themselves, I don't care about accessibility, so I'm going to use an accordion. The problem is that they include them because they have more content than they really want to put on the page by default. So many of the accessibility problems we see fundamentally come down to the fact that we can't have pages that are small and simple, and ultimately is just a one page with some links, some buttons, an input field and some text, maybe an image or two. The problem with accessibility is that we have to have more and more components. A retort to that is often that accessibility needs to catch up, that the problem is that accessibility is tied to standards that take a very slow time to evolve. And that's true. A problem with accessibility is we are often playing catch up with modern trends. The issue with those trends being, however, that all they're doing is trying to find new ways to add more and more to pages. We struggle to make the web accessible because we struggle to keep up with ever more elaborate ways to avoid making tough editorial decisions. Because ultimately, the web would be a lot more accessible if ultimately there was a lot less on it. And so I often get asked, what's the best solution? How do I make things more accessible? Should I learn ARIA? Should I involve my developers on maybe a screen reader training course, for example? And the answer is yes, those would help. If we come along and we introduce the standards to you and talk about the kind of testing that we're going to do, such that you can look at the kind of public documentation that's out there to get a sense of, oh, right, I didn't realize that if I did it that way, then actually I'm potentially affecting the operability of this button with a screen reader. That's incredibly useful. And as well, getting people involved in this technology allows them to develop things outside of a bubble. It allows them to not just be people that are making websites that are just for them or just for people that feel like them, which is generally, say, able-bodied 20s to 40s developers that are kind of making websites that they assume they can see and they can use a mouse, etc. So what's the issue? Well, the solution is saying no. When someone comes to you and says, we have this idea, but the data points to this, and the next big thing is this, so we really need to include an extra page on the AI or the blockchain, or we're told that, well, loads of users really want this, and we should do this, can we do this, and can we try this? The answer is no. The issue being that accessibility problems are created by not saying no. And if we have websites that are ultimately a lot leaner, we would see a drastic reduction in the amount of issues that we have. Because accessibility should be less about creating an unfiltered mountain of content and trying to make that accessible. Because that's the point we're at the moment. We create incredibly complicated websites and we find more and more ways to try to make them accessible, whilst ARIA is constantly playing catch up with the kind of new complicated components that ultimately just look to add more to the page. Accessibility should be more about cutting content, because the hope that I can kind of encourage people to be is ruthless. Cut your content. Look at your paragraph, cut it in half again, identify what the exact core requirement of your website is and deliver that. Develop things that are slim and streamlined. And if you do that, a lot of it is going to be accessible by default. And that's the answer, really, is saying no, is to look at all the complicated things that are out there and not using them. Because there are ways of making it accessible, and then they will break. They'll break in the next update of whatever the assistive technology is, when the browser updates, when the standards change, or maybe you move to a different code base. We're making these websites with duct tape, and we're attaching accessibility on to websites that we know are broken. We know that there's a beautiful, basically working front end with a kind of monstrous and unscalable back end that we know is very difficult. But we don't like to think about it. And what accessibility does is it makes us think about it. It makes us realize that actually what we need to do is say no to all the incredibly complicated things we're doing on the web. So thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you very much, Dafydd. That was an awesome talk. I'm seeing a lot of action on Twitter.
Ooh, I'm scared.
I don't know that we have a lot of questions. Mr. Caldwell, do we have any questions?
Yeah, no, I don't think there are, but I have a question if that's all right.
Of course.
So you talked quite a lot actually about your experience of testing with I suppose real people and disabled people. Out of all of the things that you've talked about, what do you see as being the most damaging, say, component that is causing the most problems for users in the real world?
I'm tempted to say carousels with that, in my experience. Just in as much as the experience that we've kind of had has been a thing of, oh, there's a carousel. My first behavior is to stop it. If I can't stop it, then I'm not going to look at the page and I'm not going to look at where it is. And the thing being that actually when content is only available in that carousel and the first instinct is to stop it, what that often involves is users saying, oh, I'm going to lock myself out of being able to access that information. So I'd say that's the kind of the real one that kind of ends up in blockers.
Great. Yeah, no, I'd agree. We have had a question on Twitter actually. So it's from the UMass Amherst ATC Twitter account, and they've asked, how do you go about saying no when designing a workflow-based system that is complex due to the workflow process being complex?
Ooh, that's a very good question. So something that I kind of want to ensure that I'm kind of making plain is I'm not saying don't make something that is complicated per se. The kind of point I want to make is the issue we have with accessibility is that things are needlessly complicated. So for example, we'll have a website that ultimately could just be extraordinarily simple, but isn't. And so the thing to say is, identify what is the minimum you need. What are the exact core of what you need, and developing that and delivering that. Now, that might be one that kind of forks out and branches in kind of very different ways. But the thing to say is deliver the kind of minimum you can. And ultimately, that might be still quite complicated. The thing being that it's less complicated than it otherwise would be if throughout the process we weren't saying, no, but that's not really, that is kind of an extra, or, well, I don't know, that kind of adds a lot with that kind of, those kind of conversations. So I'm not inherently saying that kind of anything complicated is bad, but that anything that could be simpler is problematic.
I guess it's the just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly.
type of mentality.
Yeah.
Great.
And I think that's kind of issue that we have with accessibility, where it exposes that in a way that I think often isn't exposed, because I think the mentality is, well, we know it's complicated and we know it's complicated and it needs to be, but that we think that's okay. And when we come along with accessibility and we raise so many issues, a lot of them come down to the fact that it couldn't have been made more simpler in the first place.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Awesome. I will end my slideshow / stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Well, I guess if we don't have any other questions, we will wrap early and we will return at the top of the hour. I'd like to thank you again, Dafydd, for your time. I'd like to thank David Caldwell for stepping in and helping us out. Just a reminder that if you like this session, please hit that like button on YouTube, and don't forget you can subscribe to our channel for future notifications. A reminder that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciella Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. And with special thanks to our sponsors, DQ Systems. Inclusive Design will be back at the top of the hour with actually David Caldwell, and he'll be talking about building inclusive products for vulnerable circumstances. All right. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.